Thank you, Willoughby. As I was just saying, it's so meaningful for me to be talking with this group. I learned about it from an article in the Atlantic in 2014, and that was about 4 years after my own meditation-related breakdown and 4 years into my research. And I spoke to Professor Britton around that time, and it was so powerful to learn that people were studying the kind of experience I'd been through, that there was language for it, that there was a community helping each other through it. It was just profound. So now I hope I can be of some use in return. So the group I was meditating with when I ran into trouble is a small but international meditation group that goes by several names: Open Heart Meditation, Padma Cahaya, which is Indonesian for lotus light, and Reiki Tumo. And they've added more arms to the organization since. I characterize it as an ecstatic practice. My meditation breakdown was the most terror-filled experience of my life by far. The analytic psychologist and psychiatrist Carl Jung said about one esoteric style of meditation that it, quote, ought not to be meddled with in our typically Western way. It is a meddling with fate which strikes at the very roots of human existence and can let loose a flood of sufferings of which no sane person ever dreamed. Of those sufferings, he named psychological dismemberment, and that description really resonated for me. So when I started researching, a few minutes at a time, a few days into my breakdown, it was urgent. It was for survival. Later, it became more about understanding what happened. I was an educated person with lots of friends. I needed to know how this happened to be certain that I'd never be condemned to repeat it. Over the years, I encountered varied interpretations, conducted interviews, read psychoanalytic theory, articles and books by cult experts and survivors, then by professors of religion and sociology, and my opinions went one way and then another until over the course of a decade plus, they settled on the conclusions that appear in my recent article, which I'll discuss a bit. At the Virginia Quarterly Review, where that article appears, I was writing for a more general audience, whereas here I've been asked to share a letter to my former self. So here I'll share more of my personal story with more of what I learned that I wish I'd known during my involvement with open heart meditation and during my breakdown. And I'll finish with some practices that help my recovery, though of course I am not a doctor. Survival notes aside, I also sense that there's intrinsic value in our telling these stories. One, because they remain sort of hard to find, especially in a somewhat academic context. And two, these stories have the potential to create solidarity among those of us who have been through them. And this can foster the strength needed to get well or more well and find new meaning in what occurred. And when I'm done, I hope that you might share insights from your own experiences if you're comfortable. And I think if anyone starts to feel unwell for any reason, you should please let us know. So I discovered open heart meditation in January of 2009. I was 28 years old. I was living in Los Angeles, my hometown, and working as the food editor at Yahoo. I was feeling tremendous stress and pressure to perform because the Great Recession kept setting off waves of mass layoffs. I was fighting for my job and simultaneously desperate to find a different one. Instead of working on thoughtful stories like I'd always planned, I was tasked with squeezing out additional seconds of audience attention by assigning articles like the best and worst drive-through fries or myths about the Master Cleanse diet. Stories that appeal to base interests in good versus bad, thinness, and other narrow cultural ideals that I've come to think of as American standards of purity. It was soul crushing. So, as part of a New Year's resolution, I started looking into other work opportunities. And I reached out to an interesting writer about my age who I discovered online. We'll call him Brandon. We met at a Santa Monica Starbucks, which I now think of as a bit culty since all the locations are dressed the same. Brandon had brightness about him, curly hair, and made conversation easy. He informed me that the publishing market was even worse than I feared, which I found crushing. What would I do? The conversation pivoted, and Brandon was the one to tell me about open heart meditation, an amazing new practice he'd been doing 2 hours a day. While 2 hours a day did sound excessive to me then, I wish I'd known that it could actually be dangerous. I would never have admit then that I was already interested in Brandon romantically, but I was. A number of my close friends were getting engaged or married that year, and I was pained that I did not even have a boyfriend to take to their wedding, let alone to build a home with. So I wish I'd also known that following a romantic interest into a spiritual group may lead you in faster and deeper than you otherwise would go. I wish I'd asked myself each step along the way, would I attend this event if Brandon was not involved? Within a week, I was at my first open heart meditation meetup. The weekly event was held at a nice townhouse near Mid-City. About 15 people of all different backgrounds were there. Brandon and I had been emailing, so I knew he was on a business trip, but already looked forward to seeing him next time. Instead, his friend, who I'll call Paul, greeted me. The meditation turned out to be a mashup of a 3,000-year-old Taoist smiling meditation and loving kindness meditation based on one of Buddhism's earliest sutras. No one mentioned that. I only heard that open heart meditation was developed by the group's founder, Saya Effendi, who was from Indonesia but lived in Australia. They called him Erman. I wish I'd realized that it's a red flag when a group fails to acknowledge the long history of their practice and instead credits only the group leader. To do open heart meditation, you closed your eyes, your finger touched your heart, and you were supposed to smile gently. I was put off by the rosiness of that instruction, as well as the recording they played of Erman reciting a prayer that they said was non-denominational. It focused on cleansing various impurities from the heart: anger, arrogance, resentment, selfishness, envy, jealousy, like the list went on. It sounded like Erman was overly interested in sin, so I didn't listen closely to that part. I wish I'd listened closely while making a decision like whether to invest myself in a particular spiritual group. Eventually, I'd learned that open heart was obsessed with purity. So, the demand for purity is one of 8 psychological themes of totalism, which is a schema I really wish I'd known about earlier. And I'm going to pull up a quick slide. So, besides the demand for purity, the other 7 themes, which will come up later, are milieu control, sacred science, mystical manipulation, loading the language, cult of confession, doctrine over person, and dispensing of existence. The well-known psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Robert J. Lifton identified these themes in his famous 1961 study of survivors from the so-called re-education camps of the Chinese Revolution in 1949. Lifton said that the more these 8 themes are present, the more totalist a culture is. While totalitarianism is a political concept, totalism is a psychological one coined by Lifton to describe an extremist meeting ground between people and ideas. In their pursuit for fixity and absoluteness, totalists demand an all or none commitment to their ideologies. So with the demand for purity theme, Lifton observed that a group's view of, quote, The experiential world is sharply divided into the pure and impure. This is problematic because everyone is imperfect and impure. For example, the open heart prayer asked for anger to be cleansed from the heart. This let listeners know that the group regarded anger as bad. Except anger can be a useful emotion and everyone feels it. So everyone in the group starts to feel shameful about being impure. To get rid of the uncomfortable shame feeling, individuals become more willing to follow demands of the group leaders. This theme, like the others, sometimes transpires unintentionally since it is an instinctual human method of getting what we want. At my first open heart meeting, I was on guard for a nebulous, undefined hazard that we call cults. It would have been far more protective to have been aware of the 8 themes of totalism, which are studied, carefully defined, and widely respected. While I mentioned there were aspects of this first group meeting that I didn't love, I did experience the meditation itself as positive and powerful. Growing up on the West Coast, I'd had a good amount of exposure to meditation, even though my family was non-practicing Jewish and Greek Orthodox. But that first open heart meeting was the first time I'd noticed a meditation prompt a melting sensation in my chest, and after a while, I felt motion there, sort of like that tunnel you hear about before you die, or maybe it was more like the roll of MDMA. When the bell dinged at the end of the session, I was damp with sweat from sheer nerves and excitement. I opened my eyes and felt like I was returning from an intergalactic distance. I had heard about transcendent meditation experiences and was elated to think I'd peeked into that secret cavern. I went to the meeting the next week and the one after that, where I was then invited to the weekend practice. I had long conversations with Brandon at these events, and we started emailing almost daily. Weeks passed, a month or two. Something I wish I'd known, that fundamentalist beliefs are easily expressed without using religious words. For example, the Open Heart group told beginners it was not a religious organization, and instead of using God, they used the term true source to avoid alarming people who, statistics say, are increasingly repelled by religious dogma. Another example came up when Brandon started giving me mixed signals. I eventually got up the chutzpah to ask him what was going on between us, and he expressed, as we could call it, wariness. He said he was worried that a romantic relationship could distract him from his spiritual commitment. He added that life without true source would be a misdirected one, saying that people did not leave the path of the heart because it was the way home. And he meant the only way home. I ignored this fundamentalism partly because he didn't say the path of Christ or Moses or Allah. He used that loving word heart. Unconsciously and wrongly, I thought of religious fundamentalism as an issue among a segment of Judeo-Christian and Muslim traditions. I didn't think of meditation-related spirituality as being at risk. I might have done well to recognize that fundamentalism is a stripe that runs through all cultures. The first 3-day workshop I attended was held at a cool loft in downtown LA. The teacher was a high-level student of Erman's who had flown in from Indonesia. Coming to this event represented a new level of commitment to the group. I took time off work. I paid a couple $100. We were going to be introduced to Reiki, which the group used to deepen meditation. Although I never pictured myself learning Reiki, I had continued having powerful meditations with this group, as well as on my own at home, 20 minutes in the morning and at night. So I reminded myself that the key in Reiki was supposed to be the same as Qi, the life force energy that acupuncturists work with in lots of Western hospitals. I wish I had known that when a group you're meditating with dismisses your concerns, even with enormous friendliness, it is a big problem. At the end of the first day of the workshop, each attendee went behind a Japanese screen with the teacher, who said he was going to give us an energetic attunement to clear a channel down our spinal column that would activate kundalini and allow us to channel Reiki. It sounded pretty out there, but I was curious. When my turn came, I went to the teacher, sat in a folding chair, closed my eyes as I was told to, and I was more than surprised to feel pressure non-physical pressure, first in my neck and then down through the center of my body. It seemed impossible, a trick of my mind, many would say, but I still attest that my body very precisely felt it. When I walked back to where everyone else was meditating, I started shaking, so much that I thought I was going to fall. One of the senior members, Paul's girlfriend, Anna, who was becoming a friend of mine, walked me to a couch at the back of the room. As I tried to relax, I expressed to her and Brandon that I was really scared about how my body was reacting to whatever had just happened. And I felt stupid worrying about invisible things I hadn't believed in minutes earlier, but I asked if they thought this whole process might be going too fast. Instead of discussing options for slowing down, they all dismissed my concerns by pushing platitudes like, don't worry, it's happening the way it should, and trust the process, it's just cleansing. The word cleansing, I would learn, was critical to the group's philosophy. They contended that when negative energy cleared out, it could cause physical and emotional distress of all kinds. Feelings of fear, a complaint, and so on were just versions of cleansing. After that, the group constantly used the word to dismiss my questions and concerns. So while the open heart term cleansing relates to the demand for purity, right? It also exemplifies another one of Lifton's psychological themes of totalism. This theme is loading the language. Lifton defined it as the use of jargon to swallow ideas or questions that challenge the group's authority. Instead of expressing a particular issue, the group encouraged me to relabel it with one general word, cleansing. Without accurate language to reflect it, a person's, quote, imagination becomes increasingly dissociated from actual life experiences and may atrophy from disuse. On purpose or not, the group does this to cut individuals off from inner questions or doubts that might destabilize the group. For a long time, I did not talk about the good things that happened to me that year. But some very good things did happen when I started doing the recommended daily hour of Reiki exercises at home, in addition to the prayer 20 minutes in the morning and night. I relaxed. I felt immense love from some inner yet outer source. I found that I wanted to be home when I used to only want to be out with friends. I cried for important reasons I had no words for and sensed a faintly effervescent mending in my chest. I became a person who experienced more belonging in the world. I was changing and wanted to share the goodness. I brought friends to practices. One of them, who I'll call Kat, was a new therapist and she began attending additional workshops with me. While the hour and 40 minutes of at-home exercises was quite a lot, I was the one who decided to take things in an even more excessive, maybe addictive direction. The practice could make me feel placid or ecstatic, and I wanted to feel that as much as possible. So I listened to the prayer in my car during my awful hour-long commute to work. I listened in my cubicle to drown out my deadening work. I knew about the idea of a bliss junkie. I was concerned about it, but the thought did not slow me down because I preferred to see myself as virtuously striving for some kind of enlightenment. In the quote I used at the beginning by Jung, he says that a Western approach can be problematic. When I think of that, I think of myself striving for enlightenment and alternately numbing out that same striving productivity approach to existence that is so futile. Psychological and spiritual advancement had become my focus because Brandon was showing himself to be another guy in a long, disappointing romantic pattern of unboyfriends. My goal was to transcend all that for a more reciprocal model, not easy to find in a totalist group. At one of the workshops, we learned that an important open heart goal was actually to be in your heart, in the feeling all the time, a sort of open eyed meditation as you went about your day. Thousands of times a day, I discovered that I was not inside the heart feeling and would scold myself to be more disciplined in how I surrender. I wish I knew that policing one's own feelings and thoughts, minute to minute, was a sign of a controlling practice, and in my case, a controlling practitioner. At the very least, this was a signal to greatly relax my approach. I remember trying to stay in the heart feeling as I attended one of my work team meetings. It was difficult to do and pay attention to what was going on around the conference table. Meditating open-eyed like this demoted the physical world, so the gathered faces looked as though they were a long distance away. Essentially, I was in a dissociated state, a familiar state for me, even though I didn't realize it at the time. I wish I had known that a history of derealization and depersonalization, types of dissociative disorders, might attract me to a meditation that made me feel similarly and might put me at risk for a meditation breakdown. I wish that the group had been required to. Back in 2009, I didn't yet have words for those experiences of derealization and depersonalization that I'd had in my past. But I do wonder if I'd been given the opportunity to read descriptions of them in a handout at meetups, whether I might have recognized that they were in my cabinet of coping mechanisms. I'd had a pronounced experience of derealization for several months when I was 14 years old, when a series of sad things happened to me and my family. A recent divorce, a different financial crisis, a house we had to sell, my father considering a move without me to another state. Not to mention that 14 is just a hormonal torture chamber. On top of all that, my family was not comfortable talking about how I was feeling. In a much cited paper called On the Nature of Dissociation in the Psychoanalytic Quarterly Journal, psychoanalyst Gary Whitmer postulates that dissociation develops when caretakers are unable to mirror and engage with certain emotional and physical experiences of the infant. Many loving families have difficulty interacting with pain, discontent, or even joy in their children. Nonetheless, Whitmer says such ignored experiences may fail to become real to the child and become dissociated, taking on a, quote, me but not me quality. Several months into my involvement with Open Heart, the positive effects of the exercises began to be overshadowed by really negative ones, and I know this is a common trajectory. I often felt racing feelings in my chest at night. In my head, there could be uncomfortable pressure and sometimes pleasant sensations that coincide with descriptions of ASMR, but that the group called kundalini. I'd first experienced this while practicing Reiki, but it began starting up on its own, distracting and scaring me at work. I became really worried about how much my system seemed to have changed. What if I ever wanted to stop practicing and could not turn all of this off? Anytime I was asked, Anytime I asked more experienced friends in the group about these perplexing reactions, I got the expected answer. Cleansing. Be grateful. Outside of the group, I also felt I could not discuss my concerns with friends or the new kind of wonderful guy I'd met at a music show and had started dating. I didn't want any of them to think I was in a cult. So I kept sending my anxieties to the me but not me orbit where I'd always kept them. That's where I was at in October, 9 months after my first meeting, when Erman, who I still had not met in person, announced he would hold a week-long retreat just outside LA. The event would take place in the not especially charming industrial town of Fullerton at a Crown Plaza business hotel. I'd expected a more natural setting, but have since recognized that Open Heart particularly helped people cope with harsh corporate climates. The unusual things that had already occurred shrank in comparison to what was about to go down. When Erman first took the stage of the hotel ballroom in front of about 100 attendees, mostly from Australia, Germany, and the US, he joked, "Not all of you know me, but all of you know my voice." The crowd laughed because we all listened to his recordings so much and clapped like we were at a rock concert. But a dissociated part of me cringed. Erman had a flat, somewhat unfriendly affect and sounded kind of narcissistic as he basked in the fame of his voice. Even when Paul introduced me and Kat to him, Erman was difficult to connect to. He gave us weightless hugs, said we were doing well, but also gave us the confusing instruction to meditate with more heart, but less trying. Why were our senior friends so crazy about him? Well, the sociologist and religion scholar Lauren Dawson indicates that charisma is not a single set of personality traits. So for example, he gives the example of Hitler and Gandhi, so it's not a single set of personality traits. but charisma depends more on the eye of the beholder. In fact, charisma is thought to be more of a social relationship built with the help of followers. I wasn't at all impressed until I experienced how much more euphoric the meditation was in Erman's presence. I was conditioned to credit him, even if the larger group had more to do with it. The first 2 days were packed with meditative exercises, and the ecstasy became so intoxicating that a number of advanced practitioners could be heard moaning with pleasure. Sociologist Max Weber notes that the ability to produce such states of ecstasy is what draws followers to new religious leaders. Indeed, I felt super high. The group feigned concern for our physical bodies. You should do some exercise, a senior said one night around 10 p.m. When? My friend Kat asked, since our activities had started at 8 a.m. I wish I'd known that it's a big red flag when a spiritual group devalues the body, which represents our lives here and now. If a group doesn't care about that, many wrongs can be justified, and crucial emotional or psychological information, which makes itself known exclusively through the body, can be swept aside. The body was so devalued in open heart that when you hugged a senior, you might be reminded to hug lightly in order to feel the feeling instead of the arms around you. For a while, this didn't bother me because I'd been raised to pay more attention to my thoughts than to my body. The third day I was supposed to learn, the third day I was surprised to learn was a break so that Erman could go with his family to Disneyland. We'd all taken the day off work and paid for hotel rooms so Erman could have a separate entertainment day. If he was leaving, I would too, since my new boyfriend from the music show was about to leave the country for a month. My senior friends did not think my overnight getaway was a good idea because they said we were so surrendered and channeling so much energy that I could run into problems. I went anyway and enjoyed a sunny fall day, sneaking into a hotel swimming pool. But in the dead of night at my boyfriend's apartment, I woke up with massive pressure in my chest. I stumbled to the living room and called two senior friends in the group who told me I could contact them night or day, but neither answered. When my boyfriend came into the room to ask me what was wrong, I had no words I felt comfortable using with him. It took me some years and that phone call with Professor Britton to see the obvious here, that I was probably having a panic attack. However, I don't think it's the only valid interpretation. Whatever it was definitely a warning that I was in over my head. I wish I'd listened to the messages streaming from my body, this time and many, many times before. When I returned to Fullerton, it was to begin a new segment of the event, the spiritual retreat. There were fewer attendees, maybe 25, since there were many more prerequisite workshops. Taking the meditative position, hand on heart, on a padded banquet chair in the ballroom, I quickly dropped back into the fuzzy, ecstatic cocoon I'd become used to. I kept thinking about a teacher I'd once had who suggested that I could pick and choose useful portions of spiritual traditions without accepting anything whole. I wish I'd known that this applied better to reading material than to in-person groups. As Erman spoke about wicked people saving themselves by opening their hearts at the end of their lives, I figured Kat and I would probably go back to our local group meetings and skip future retreats. All the while, Erman encouraged us to let go more and more with each session, and I kept feeling more inebriated. While surrender makes ecstatic states possible, I wish I'd known that a hyper focus on surrender or letting go is a red flag that a teacher may be interested in power, your surrender to them. A short while later, Kat's hand landed on my shoulder, reminding me that I had a shoulder. She told me she actually was so intoxicated that she was afraid she wouldn't be able to come down. Maybe ever. Having a really hard time. When she raised her hand, the unplanned event caused tension in the room. Erman abruptly stopped lecturing and looked at her. I feel much too high, Kat said. Like, am I dying? Am I going the right direction? Instead of responding to Kat, Erman turned away and addressed the audience on the other side of the room. Very impressive, he said sardonically and bizarrely. He wants to die for true source. She wants to be in the history books like Alexander the Great. The crowd started laughing at Kat. These were our friends. Ehrman resumed his lecture, but Kat tried again. She said, that was definitely not what she meant. She was really scared and wanted to know what the reason was to be this high. Instead of softening, Ehrman accused her of the worst open heart sin. He said, if you're afraid of dying, you don't love True Source enough. Kat and I looked at each other with big eyes. It was a moment at once bananas and also frightening because of how inebriated we felt and the level of obedience Ehrman expected. It appeared that this leader did not know how to help someone who was overdosing on his practice and was willing to be cruel to cover that up. Kat told me she was ready to leave. I told her I didn't want to leave reactively. New age jargon for I'm not ready. Then I convinced her to stay too. There was a time during my research where I thought that I stayed at that point because of cult brainwashing, but I've come to believe it was simply everything I'd lose if I left. The ecstasy and love I felt, the meditations, my friends there, the meaning and structure it brought to my days. And there was another reason that was proving sticky, having access to people who were familiar with the energetic phenomena that had been disturbing me every day. These have been called exit costs. You stay until the problems with the group outweigh the exit costs. Robert J. Lifton wrote that the presence of the psychological themes of totalism in a group is not constant. They come and go. At this point in the retreat, they came. Milieu control was a theme that had already been in effect because we were at a retreat with days-long education and meditation, and without the usual interaction of daily realities, friends, news to influence our opinions. Even though I'd spent the prior day elsewhere, Ehrman's teachings and authority surely had more sway with me than they would have at, say, a couple-hour event near my house. The totalist theme of sacred science showed up after lunch that day. Though I'd been told many times that the organization was not religious, Ehrman stood in front of a painfully simplistic diagram projected on the wall. He was detailing the cosmological revelations of the religion he discovered. He announced to the engrossed audience that the goal for each of us was to reincarnate up through 365 learning dimensions, plus 7 additional dimensions in heaven, unite with True Source. Ehrman said, after you die, you are sent for reincarnation, released, or a patrol of souls carried you to hell. A dim realm for sinners who did not properly follow True Source, i.e., Ehrman's teachings. It was not for your mind to believe, Ehrman said. You should feel this truth in your heart. Of course, if you couldn't, it was because your heart was not ready. Lifton described the theme of sacred science as a group's attempt to assign airtight logic to their moral vision, construct an absolute truth that must be worshipped. I'll forever remember Kat turning to me and saying, this is a very big bummer. The claims and situation were so crazy we had to laugh. We believed we were much too sophisticated for this and therefore quite safe from Ehrman's threat of damnation if we were to choose another path. Yet I'd soon find out that unconsciously, a residue of that threat was slowly sinking into the creases of my brain. Kat asked again if I was ready to leave, but I wasn't. It remains embarrassing for me to admit that I was still present the next day for an activity as suspect as a past life regression. It would demonstrate 2 more of Lifton's psychological themes of totalism, the cult of confession and the dispensing of existence. In short, Ehrman called up our friend Anna onto the ballroom stage and led her into a deep meditative state, through the layers of her heart and then back through her lifetime. I was riveted by the weirdness. Ehrman asked her questions. Who was she, a samurai? Was she a good worker? Yes. Did she pray? Not often. In the theme of the cult of confession, Lifton says the totalist group, quote, demands that one confess to crimes one has not committed, to sinfulness that is artificially induced, in the name of a cure that is arbitrarily imposed. These confessions serve multiple purposes. One, followers purge the excessive guilt they carry due to the demand for purity and possibly their own upbringing, and this temporarily helps them feel pure. Two, it's an opportunity for members to display their loyalty to the group and its leaders. And three, it helps create a culture of total exposure so that private ownership of the mind and its thoughts, imagination, and dissent becomes severely immoral. Ermin's questions continued until he told Anna to go to her death, which is when she dropped from the chair to the floor and began writhing and shrieking. She was a reserved person, so I could barely believe it was her. Ermin asked, "As you die, what is it like to know that you did not love True Source enough?" Anna screamed louder and louder until Ermin told her to stop and return to present. When she hurried out of the ballroom door, her head was bent with what looked like humiliation, like she'd sacrificed to Ermin something immense. The theme of dispensing of existence can be literal, as it has been in communist revolutions or the Nazi police state. Those who do not adhere to the sacred science are considered evil and deserving of death. According to Lifton, individuals are faced with the choice of being versus nothingness. However, the threat of death or damnation can be metaphoric, as it was here. Lifton wrote, quote, "Existence comes to depend upon creed. I believe, therefore I am. Upon submission, I obey, therefore I am, and upon a sense of total merger with the ideological movement." While all of this can sound so severe as to appear foreign to us, this theme, like the others, is intrinsic to human experience. An infant or young child instinctively complies, eventually, with caretakers so as not to be left to die. So when a group taps into this ancient fear, disagreeing with the group can trigger, quote, "fear of annihilation." I was in a mind-numbing haze, but beneath that, I suspect, lay a true horror of this man who had so much sway over my friend Anna, and of being versus nothingness. I was caught between a dread of staying and a dread of leaving. Within the hour, I was lying in a ball in a corner of the room with Kat. When Paul came to check on me, he had no real advice. Just let the cleansing happen. The central anxiety of my breakdown would be this: my system had evolved beyond the comprehension of any outsider and was severely malfunctioning. I was at great risk. Only the open heart group could understand, but even they couldn't put me back together. It was a new problem, but an echo of the intense isolation and terror experienced by any child subject to emotional neglect. After breakfast the next morning, I could not convince myself to follow the group into the meditation session. My body was heavy, fatigued, and seeking silence. When Kat came to check on me, she asked if I might be ready to leave the retreat yet. In the quiet of the empty room, I could finally feel my body and locate my thoughts. I was ready. Even though no one was keeping us there, I felt the electricity of escape. We were frantic as we gathered our things, afraid we might see Ermin or our friends as we approached the hotel exit doors. Just then, a senior came hurrying after us, an older, outspoken woman with red hair. She said essentially, "Don't go. You are making the biggest mistake of your lives." But we left. My dissociated anxiety was sky high at that point, but of course I didn't know it. And it grew as Kat and I realized in the car home that we still felt like we were floating from the 4 days of meditation. I wish I knew that this trancy feeling can happen after extended meditation, that it can gently dissipate. For the first time, we called the group a cult, because cults are always groups you don't belong to. Talking about cults ratcheted up my nervousness further. The cult mythos, which we're also familiar with, Scientology's harassment of high-level defectors, the violence of Charles Manson, the mass suicide in Jonestown, poured fuel on our fire. I wish I'd had more common, less extreme stories about new religions to reflect on. I'd say my breakdown officially began that night when Kat and I were back in Los Angeles. Over dinner, we decided we should state aloud our intention to disconnect from each person in the group. We hoped this might create some clear or energetic boundary that we needed to feel safe. When I came to Erman's name, I felt a deluge of energy pour out of me. It's not rational, but I thought the loss of all that energy might kill me. I wish I knew that an enormous feeling starved of words, a feeling like extreme anxiety or panic, can feel like dying. I fell on the floor of the restaurant screaming, like Anna had. I've had mental health professionals call the state I entered semi-psychotic, since I believed certain delusions, but also was aware of my craziness. At Cats that night, I was paranoid. Now I imagined Erman was a cult leader who was still trying to energetically overpower me. I wanted to sleep, but if I did, I feared he might take more of me. So I slept only several minutes at a time. At work the next day, I almost fainted. A friend drove me home. In my apartment, I struggled to find the strength for basic activities. I remember that when I had to use the bathroom, I crawled there. The floating derealization feeling remained and depersonalization took hold. I felt like from the heights of ecstatic meditation, I'd been pushed back into my body. Somehow, the fogginess also made me feel like I had been shut out of the physical realm as punishment by Erman, who had spoken about a dim existence for those who rejected his teachings. The world appeared hard and bare and uninhabitable. I felt stuck between dimensions, me but not me. I took 2 weeks off work. I worried about suicide. I wish I had not been scared of a good psychiatrist. I wish I had not been scared to spend a couple nights at a good psychiatric hospital. I should have sought some medication to calm down and sleep, some professionals to make me feel secure while I rested. I did spend a couple nights at friends' houses. One of them gave me an anti anxiety pill that offered me a night of sleep, which was an early turning point. Meanwhile, the first useful thing I did on my own was to write in a journal. I got a lot of zany thoughts, at least out of my head for at least a little while. And in big letters on one page, I wrote, I will get home. This was a hopeful, strong commitment to make that I left on my bedside table. The ink on paper also became a visual gauge of how foggy and far away I felt each morning. Slowly, over time, I saw the words more and more clearly, which is to say, with less derealization. I also said aloud when I felt waves of energy streaming up through my body, I want to feel energy less. And immediately I would feel it less. This made me see I had more control over my system than I thought I had. Within the first month, I began seeing a therapist who was a longtime meditator. I wanted someone with that common ground. I now know that Cheetah House has an experienced peer support care team, which is just like an incredible gift. A useful recommendation my therapist had early on was to do things with my body that I enjoyed. I began taking a dance class, which helped me remember that it could be joyful to have a body. Um, Silly as it might sound now, the therapist also suggested I carry a rock in my purse that I could reach in and clutch anytime I felt too floaty or unreal. I found it surprisingly comforting, an actual anchor in the physical realm. Simple distraction like TV was also important in keeping me from constantly monitoring my physiological and emotional conditions and feeding more worry into my system. Research was a constructive diversion when I had enough energy to focus on it. The first book I read was Cults in Our Midst, a classic written in 1995 by Margaret Thaler Singer, who had been a psychologist and adjunct professor at UC Berkeley. Ultimately, I would disagree with many assertions in that book, but it was an initial lifeline that helped me understand my symptoms of floatiness and depersonalization. Well, it helped me understand, it contextualized them. Singer was also the person to popularize Lifton's 8 themes of totalism, but she used them as the definition of a brainwashing cult. She said followers of these groups did not need to question themselves because they had been systematically brainwashed. The idea of blaming open heart for everything appealed to me, but I found it hard to say that I'd been brainwashed and found it even harder to fully believe. I continued my research and learned that Lifton stipulated that forced attendance in a totalist group, meaning kidnapping or imprisonment, was a requirement of brainwashing, and even then, the effect was short lived once the prisoner was released. And I want to note here that the experience of children raised in high demand groups is really a different matter that I'm not discussing here. Singer's theory has since been rejected by the American Psychological Association and countless scholars. Outside of a prison context, though, the themes of totalism still tap into deep human needs, so they remain persuasive. In my opinion, Lifton's 8 themes, divorced from discussion of brainwashing and cults, become the most accurate metric I know of to assess the safety of a group, any group, political organizations, tech companies, schools, and even families. All groups fall somewhere on the spectrum, but the more present the themes are in a group, the more that group seeks control over its members. As wicked as the modes of totalism can sound, Lifton believed it was an idealistic response to stress and dislocation. Quote, the ever-present human quest for the omnipotent guide, the supernatural force, political party, philosophical ideas, great leader, or precise science that will bring ultimate solidarity to all men and eliminate the terror of death and nothingness. I found it protective, however, to ask myself challenging questions to understand what attracted me to this situation that I put myself in. I do know of individuals who have joined more than one group with extremist qualities. I hope I've been clear about these personal findings in my talk. My search for love and family, how the lack of emotional mirroring in my upbringing may have led me to dissociative tendencies, and a group that repeated and augmented those patterns. And while Lifton says all of us express totalist themes to some degree, I had developed more than my share of them. About the word cult, the academic consensus is that it's highly problematic because it's been historically used to malign non-Western and new religions. For decades, religion and sociology scholars have tried to let the rest of us know that there is actually no definition for a cult that separates it from religion, apart from age and size. Those who say otherwise today, often in streaming documentaries, have titles you can see on screen of anti-cult expert or sometimes therapist, but they are not credentialed scholars, with one exception as far as I know. Though a few of these new religions are really criminal and treacherous, that has also been true of mainstream religions. The word cult also creates undue shame and fear around spiritual exploration. So while Open Heart was loading its language to keep me in line, American culture was doing the same. The word cult is definitely meant to protect us, but maybe it's also meant to keep us from accessing the potent, life-altering, culture-shifting forces that first-generation experiential spirituality can unleash. Kundalini syndrome was another explanatory framework I tried on. I found Gopi Krishna's book, Living with Kundalini, a compelling sensorial telling of phenomena I seem to recognize. The condition was on my mind because in 1997, Urman had posted from Indonesia to an online message board dedicated to the topic of Kundalini syndrome. So this was before I ever knew him. He wrote that he was desperately in need of help. He was afraid he was going crazy. He explained that he'd been meditating at length, but had very limited background in spiritual matters. His symptoms included severe vibrations in his head and trouble distinguishing where his body ended and the world began. Paul reassured me that this had turned into a positive experience and that Hindus believed it was a mark of holiness. In retrospect, it also sounds a whole lot like a meditation breakdown. And as Professor Britton pointed out in our interview, the study of Kundalini syndrome doesn't offer a lot in the way of solutions. Gopi Krishna suffered for years. Britton told me there's a lot of overlap between the symptoms of Kundalini syndrome and anxiety. Through this scientific lens, it was fitting to learn that Urman's 1997 breakdown took place, like mine, during an economic upheaval. For him, it was the Asian financial crisis, which was also a time of racial violence in Indonesia against people of Chinese descent, like Urman. Learning about this helped me appreciate how the totalist propensities of nations, governments, banks, racial groups intricately influence the course of our individual lives. For me, the first couple months of the breakdown were the worst, but the derealization and depersonalization lingered. I had mini panic attacks that went on even longer, but therapy helped, EMDR helped, making sure I was taking care of myself helped, even if that meant calling an airline's accessibility department to make sure I had an aisle seat or carrying an emergency dose of Ativan everywhere. Um, in the later stages of recovery, it also helped to tell the panic attacks that they were welcome to come out if they needed to be seen. Often, this mirroring and acknowledgement is all that the panic part of me needs in order to relax. And also different somatic modalities I still find really useful. At times, I do like to return to the Hindu idea of kundalini as the energy of transformation. And I just want to add a note to that, that the somatic modalities I use now, it's not so much to deal with the after effects of my breakdown. I just came to really learn the importance of the body. At times, I do like to return to the Hindu idea of Kundalini as the energy of transformation. My breakdown did catalyze a needed revolution in me, dismantling false parts designed to please others and pulling in some of my authentic but dissociated pieces. Within several years, I remade my life into one that suited me far better. I made substantive writing the center of my career. I took a long break from some of my family members that helped shift, to some degree, problematic dynamics. I got married to that boyfriend and built the home base I'd always needed. I do believe that open heart practices helped me develop a sense of existential security and self love that made these changes possible, or helped make these changes possible, which even my breakdown could not completely undo. And as awful as it was, I learned to prioritize myself, my wellness. Was this breakdown necessary? I don't know. I hope not. At one point in my recovery, my friend's mother suggested I go to the ocean and bury my feet in the sand to feel weighed down to the ground and remember I belong to the earth. So I went to Venice Beach and sat down in a clearing free from knotted seaweed. But it wasn't the sand that helped so much, as it was the surfers in the distance, riding on top of the water no matter what shape it took. Too rigid and you fall, too soft and you never get up. I had bounced between these two poles in my life, bending too much to the will of others, or else being too severe with myself and people I love. I was inspired by the surfers' confidence in their bodies, their sublime balance of strength and flexibility. There was a direction to go. Not until later did I learn that Lifton had a concept he called the protean self, Proteus being an early Greek god of oceans and rivers. Lifton wrote that, quote, "We are capable of alternatives to totalism, even antidotes, that stem from the very structure of the human mind. One such alternative is what I call the protean self, a view of the self as always in process, as being many-sided rather than monolithic, and resilient rather than fixed," end quote. I wonder if, like us, the world cannot flourish if we do not see, engage, and mirror its impossibly great complexity.